The dark liquid trickled down her apron, across her face, mixing shame with artificial sweetness. She did not raise her eyes. She only felt the weight of the laughter piercing her skin like ice needles. Her hands trembled, clutching the soaked cloth. But something within her, ancient and dormant, began to awaken like embers beneath ashes. Before we delve into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. She wasn't sure when she had ceased to have her own name. Perhaps when they first called her simply, "You there," or when she realized that her steps only existed to make no sound. Perhaps before that, when she was still a child and discovered that her existence depended on becoming invisible in the hallways, on not occupying space, on breathing just enough to keep serving. The mansion rose over the city of London like a cathedral of stone and secrets, its towers piercing the gray sky with the arrogance of something that had always existed and always would. There, among marble-lined halls and tall windows that filtered light into golden, cold beams, she spent her days with a bucket in her hands and her body bent over the floor, cleaning what others dirtied, erasing the traces of lives that never belonged to her. She was 23, but her body carried the exhaustion of decades. Her hands, rough and marked, sometimes trembled for no reason, or perhaps for too many reasons. Her knees ached at the end of the day, and at night, when she finally lay down in the tiny room at the back of the estate, she smelled the soap embedded in her skin, as if she had become part of the work itself, indistinguishable from the tools she used. She didn't remember her mother, only a distant voice, whispering that she was born to serve, that her dark skin and dark eyes marked her as someone passing through, never meant to stay. She grew up among cooks and laundresses, learning early that silence was the only form of survival, that bowing her head was the price of another day, another meal, another bed to sleep in. And then, on that cold autumn afternoon, as the wind brought the premonition of rain and the windows groaned under the air's pressure, she crossed the main atrium carrying the bucket and the cloth, her steps almost inaudible on the floor of antique tiles. The hall was empty, or so she thought, until she heard the voices. They emerged like shadows taking shape under the wrong light. 3 young men, perhaps 4, dressed with the kind of elegance that only effortless money can buy. Their faces were young, handsome in a way that seemed sculpted, their smiles sharp as polished blades. One of them held a bottle of cola, the dark liquid swaying within the transparent glass like a promise of something sweet and treacherous. She tried to deviate, to shrink further, to become air, but they saw her. And when they saw her, something in the air changed. It was as if her presence were a silent insult, a stain on something that should be immaculate. The tallest, with fair hair and eyes that seemed to reflect nothing but his own satisfaction, tilted his head and smiled. "Well, look here," he said, his voice drawn out, lazy, the invisible one. The others laughed, a light sound, almost musical, but one that carried the weight of all the humiliations she had ever swallowed in silence. She kept walking, her body tense, her heart beating against her ribs like a trapped bird. Don't look. Don't respond. Disappear. But they wouldn't let her. The youngest, with delicate features and a smile that seemed to have been rehearsed in front of a mirror, stepped forward, blocking her path. "Where are you going in such a hurry? We're having a party here. Don't you want to join?" She stopped. Her fingers gripped the bucket handle so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her breath caught, short, as if the air itself was afraid to enter. Her eyes fixed on the floor, trying to read in the patterns of the tiles an escape route that didn't exist. "Leave her be," said another. The third, shorter, but with a smile that was worse than any word. "She doesn't speak. These creatures don't speak. They just clean." And then he raised the bottle, and the world slowed down. She saw the movement, as if submerged in thick water, each second stretching, gaining texture and weight. The dark liquid flew through the air in a perfect arc, shimmering under the light of the chandeliers, and before she could raise her hands, before she could protect herself, the cola hit her. Cold, sticky, humiliating. It spread over her apron, across her face, dripped down her hair, her neck, soaked the cloth she held, The laughter erupted. They weren't just sounds, they were knives, they were walls, they were proof that she didn't matter, that her pain was entertainment, that her existence was less than the dust she cleaned every day. She stood motionless, the liquid running, the sweet, artificial smell invading her nostrils. She did not cry. Something within her, ancient, wounded, but still alive, refused to break. Her hands trembled, but they did not drop the bucket. Her eyes burned, but they did not fill with tears. She just stood there, breathing short, while the world around her transformed into a blur of indifferent luxury and casual cruelty. "Smells good," the tallest one commented, leaning in as if appreciating a work of art. "Sweet, like servitude." They laughed again, and it was in that laughter, in that sound that echoed through the high walls, that ascended the marble stairs, that passed through corridors and closed doors, that something changed. She didn't understand what, not in that moment. She only felt a shiver that didn't come from the cold, a pressure in the air that wasn't the wind, a presence that awoke like a giant beneath the earth. The clock on the wall stopped, the chandeliers flickered, and somewhere in the depths of the mansion, someone awoke. She still didn't know, as she bent to pick up the overturned bucket. As she tried to wipe her face with trembling hands, that moment, that public humiliation, that cruel laughter, would be the beginning of something neither she nor those young men could comprehend. For there was someone who watched her, someone who always watched. And to him, that laughter was not merely sound, it was offense. It was blasphemy. It was the kind of affront that is not forgiven, that is not forgotten, that is paid for with something deeper than blood. She cleaned the floor. They left the hall, still laughing, still untouched by the gravity of what they had done. And upstairs, in the silent chambers on the top floor, where the light never fully entered and the air carried the scent of accumulated centuries, the lord of the ancient halls opened his eyes. And when he opened his eyes, the world, and without anyone yet realizing it, began to bend. She had met the lord of the ancient halls one winter night, 5 years earlier, when she still believed that death would be a relief. She was 18 and had no reason to continue. Only the stubborn habit of breathing, of waking, of dragging her body through another meaningless day. She was on the riverbank, her bare feet on ice-covered stones, the wind cutting her skin like invisible blades. The dark water moved slowly, heavy, inviting in its promise of eternal silence. She didn't remember deciding to jump. She only remembered the cold, a cold that was almost warmth, that burned within, that pulled her like gentle and terrible hands. And then, at the last second, when her body was already leaning and her balance was lost, a voice stopped her. Not here, not like this. He had appeared from nowhere, or perhaps he had always been there, waiting, tall, dressed in black, his face covered by shadows that seemed to move even when the air was still. His eyes, when she finally saw them, were like ancient mirrors, reflecting not what was before them, but what was within the one looking. And when he touched her, just the tips of his fingers on her wrist, the entire world seemed to stop spinning. "You have strength," he had said, his voice low, grave, carrying the weight of ages. "Too much strength to waste like this?" She hadn't answered. She couldn't. She just stared at him, trembling, tears freezing on her cheeks, her body swaying between wanting to flee and wanting to dissolve into that touch that was both protection and prison. "Come," he had commanded, not with brutality, but with the certainty of one who had never been disobeyed. "I have use for souls like yours." And she had gone, because she had nowhere to go, because she had no one, because his hand was firm and strangely warm, and because, for the first time in her life, someone saw her, not as a servant, not as invisible, but as something worth saving. Since then, she had lived in the mansion. He had placed her among the servants, given her a room, a uniform, a purpose. But he had also done something more. He had chosen her, not with words of love, not with romantic promises, but with a gaze that pierced and marked. He had said, "One night, that she was his wife, not by human ritual, but by an older bond woven from gratitude and destiny. She had saved him by accepting his hand that night by the river. He had chosen her by recognizing in her the silent strength of those who know humiliation and do not bend. It wasn't love, at least not the kind she knew. It was something deeper and more frightening. A fusion of souls that didn't need warmth to exist, only recognition. He had never touched her beyond what was necessary, never slept beside her, but he always knew where she was, always felt when something hurt her. And she, in turn, had learned to feel his presence as a constant weight in the air, like a shadow that followed her even in sunlight. She didn't know what he was. Not completely. Only that he was ancient, older than the mansion itself, perhaps older than the city of London. That there was something in him that did not belong to the time of men, something that observed with infinite patience and punished with surgical precision. The other servants feared him. They whispered stories about visitors who disappeared, about rooms that changed places, about doors that opened by themselves when he wished. But she had never felt fear of him, only respect. And perhaps a silent gratitude for having prevented her from falling into that dark water. Now, standing in the empty hall, her apron soaked with cola, her face burning with shame and her heart beating at a wrong rhythm, she knew he had woken. She didn't need to see him, didn't need to hear him. She only felt, as she always felt, the change in the air, the pressure that made her lungs tighten, the cold that rose through her bones as if winter had entered through the walls. She picked up the bucket. Her hands trembled so much she almost dropped it again. She tried to clean her face, but the sticky liquid clung, mixing with the tears that finally began to well up, not from pain, but from rage. An ancient, guarded, fermented rage from all those years of bowing her head, of swallowing insults, of being less than a shadow. The young men had left laughing, without looking back, without even considering that she was capable of feeling. And perhaps that was what hurt the most. Not the cold cola running down, not the public humiliation, but the absolute certainty that, for them, she didn't exist as a human being. She was an object. She was scenery. She was something to be used and discarded without a thought. But he thought, he always thought. His steps echoed before she saw him. Slow, measured, heavy as pronouncements. She raised her eyes, and there he was, descending the main staircase with the calm of one who has all eternity. Dressed in black, as always, the fabric seeming to absorb the surrounding light. His face, still partially covered by impossible shadows, revealed only his eyes. And it was these eyes that now gazed at her with an intensity that made the air around them vibrate. He said nothing. He merely walked to her, each step making the chandelier lights tremble, making the windows creak slightly, making the very floor seem to bend under the weight of his presence. When he stopped before her, the temperature plummeted. Her breath formed a white cloud in the air. Her hands, already trembling, froze. He raised his hand, and she closed her eyes. Not from fear, but from something akin to surrender. His fingers touched her face, sliding slowly, wiping away the sticky liquid with a gentleness that contrasted violently with the tension in the air. His touch was cold, it always had been, but it carried something she couldn't name. Care, perhaps, or contained fury. Who? His voice was low, but each syllable reverberated like distant thunder. She swallowed hard. Her lips trembled. It doesn't matter. It matters. He tilted his head, his eyes shining with something that seemed too ancient to be merely anger. Everything that harms you matters. She looked away, unable to sustain the intensity of that gaze that seemed to peel back layers of her soul. They were young, guests, sons of important families. They merely played. He repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. Si. And you believe that? Silence. Only the sound of her breath, short and uneven, and his sound, or the absence of it, because he didn't seem to breathe in the same way as the living. No, she admitted finally, her voice breaking. But what does it matter what I believe? He held her chin, forcing her to face him. His touch was firm, but it didn't hurt. It never hurt. Everything matters. You are mine, and whoever touches what is mine pays the price. She felt a shiver, not of fear, but of something more complex. There was comfort in those words, but also terror, because she knew, deep down, that the price he would exact would not be measured in apologies or regrets. It would be measured in something much deeper. "Don't do anything," she whispered, her voice desperate. "Please, it will only make things worse. They won't do anything." He released her chin and stepped back, but his gaze did not waver. "Because there will be no them." And before she could ask what that meant, he turned and walked back to the stairs, his steps echoing, his presence filling every corner of the hall. When he reached the first step, he paused and, without looking back, said, "Change your clothes. Rest. Tonight, you clean nothing. Tonight, others clean for you." And then he ascended, and with each step, the air returned to normal, the temperature rose, the lights ceased to flicker. But she knew, felt it in her bones, that something had been set in motion, something inevitable, something neither she nor those young men yet understood. She stood there, alone in the silent hall, her apron soaked, her heart beating erratically, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt not gratitude or respect, but fear. Not for her, for them. For those who laughed, for those who did not know that some offenses are not measured in spilled cola, but in broken silences and exhausted patience. Outside, the rain began to fall, heavy, hard, like tears from the sky, and inside the mansion, in the upper chambers where no one else dared to enter, the lord of the ancient halls prepared what was to come. The price, after all, is always paid, just never in the way fools expect. Night fell like a heavy veil over the mansion, bringing with it a silence that was unnatural. Not even the wind dared to blow. The windows remained still, the curtains hanging like shrouds, and the air within the halls seemed too thick to breathe comfortably. She had locked herself in her tiny room, still wearing the soaked uniform, unable to follow his order to change and rest. How could she rest when the world seemed to be holding its breath? She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the closed door. Outside, she heard the muffled sounds of the mansion, distant footsteps, doors closing, the low murmur of the other servants who retired early, as if instinctively knowing that this was not a night to be awake. But she couldn't sleep. She just stayed there, feeling her own heart beat at a wrong rhythm, feeling the weight of something that was to come. She remembered the faces of the young men. The tallest, with fair hair, who held the bottle with such cruel nonchalance. The youngest, with a handsome, empty smile. The third, shorter, with eyes that gleamed with malice. They were just boys, she realized now. Spoiled boys who had never faced consequences, who grew up believing that the world existed to serve them, that others' pain was an abstraction with no real weight. But he would not see them that way. To him, they were offenders. And offenses, she knew, he did not forgive. The clock on the wall struck midnight, and then stopped. The second hand froze, and in the silence that followed, she heard. They weren't sounds exactly. They were absences of sound, places where the air seemed to suck voices, where footsteps disappeared before echoing, and then, far away, almost imperceptible, a scream. Short, muffled, as if someone had tried to scream, and the voice died in their throat. She rose instinctively, her body tense, her hands cold. She wanted to open the door, to run, to see, but her feet wouldn't move. Something held her there, not physically, but as if a will greater than her own had decided that she should not witness what would happen that night. She stood, trembling, breathing short. While outside, in the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, something was unfolding. The young men had been accommodated in the guest rooms on the second floor, luxurious suites with enormous beds, velvet curtains, and marble fireplaces. They didn't know that those rooms, beautiful as they were, had a history, that others had slept there and never woken up the same way. that the mansion was not just stone and wood, but something alive, something that observed and judged. The tallest one awoke first. He didn't know why. He just felt a weight on his chest, a pressure in his lungs, as if the air had become solid. He opened his eyes and found darkness. Not the normal darkness of night, but something denser, more absolute, as if the light itself had been devoured. He tried to move and realized he couldn't. His arms, his legs, his neck, all paralyzed. Only his eyes moved, scanning the blackness in search of form, of meaning, of anything that would explain the growing terror. And then he saw, or thought he saw, a figure in the corner of the room, tall, motionless, made of shadows darker than the surrounding darkness. It had no face, or it had all faces, shifting, flowing, never settling into a recognizable form. And when it spoke, the voice did not come from a specific point, but from everywhere at once, as if the very walls whispered, "You laughed." The young man tried to scream, but no sound came out. His throat closed, his lungs compressed, and fear, pure, primal, devastating, flooded every cell of his body. You poured shame upon one who did not deserve it. You thought there would be no price. The figure moved, or seemed to move, because in truth it did not walk. It merely existed in one place and then another, without transition, without space between. Now it was beside the bed, leaning in, and the young man could feel the cold emanating from it, a cold that burned, that penetrated bones and marrow. "The price," the voice continued, "is forgetfulness, not of memory, worse, of meaning." And then it touched, just the tip of a finger on the young man's forehead, and the instant the touch happened, the world exploded in shards of sensation, not pain, something worse than pain, an absence, an emptiness, as if part of him was torn not from his body, but from his very essence. And when the touch withdrew, he knew that something had changed, that something within him would never be the same. In the other rooms, similar scenes unfolded. The youngest, with a handsome face, awoke to find his own image reflected in 1,000 mirrors that had not been there when he fell asleep. And in each reflection, he saw himself not as he was, but as he would be, aged, disfigured, forgotten, rotting in loneliness. He saw every cruel laugh he had given, every humiliation he had caused, returning as a distorted echo. And he couldn't look away, couldn't close his eyelids, just look and look until his sanity began to unravel. The third, the shortest, awoke to a sensation of weight. He looked down and saw his own hands. But they were no longer his. They were her hands, the hands of the woman he had helped humiliate. Rough, marked, trembling with exhaustion. And then he felt all the weariness, all the accumulated pain, all the exhaustion of years of bending, cleaning, serving. He felt it in his bones, in his muscles, in his soul. And it was not borrowed memory, it was real, visceral, inescapable. She remained in her room, standing, her hands clenching the fabric of her uniform, her wide eyes fixed on the door. She heard now muffled screams, sounds of falling, the creaking of wood under pressure. But she dared not leave. She knew, somehow, that witnessing would be participating, and participating would be becoming part of whatever was happening. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the silence returned. Absolute. Sepulchral, as if the entire mansion had sighed and quieted. She waited, trembling, counting the seconds that felt like hours. The door opened. She took a step back, her heart racing, but it was just him, the Lord of the ancient halls, standing in the doorway, watching her with that terrible calm. There was no blood on his clothes, no mark of violence, only his gaze, heavy, weary, ancient. "It is done," he said, simply. What did you do?" Her voice came out weak, brittle. He did not answer immediately. He merely entered the room, closed the door behind him, and sat on the single chair, a gesture so human, so common, that it contrasted violently with everything she knew about him. "I gave them a fraction of what you feel every day," he said finally. "I didn't kill them. I didn't physically harm them. I merely made them understand. Understand what? That existing on the margins is not an absence of life. It is an excess of unrecognized life. That ignoring someone's humanity is not freedom. It is a prison. Theirs, not yours. She sat on the bed, her legs too weak to support her weight. Will they tell? Will they sue? Will they... No. His voice was firm. They will not remember in a way they can articulate. They will only feel, in the silent nights, in the lonely moments, when they look at their own reflection, they will feel, and they will know that something marked them, but they will never be able to say what. She looked at her own hands, still trembling, still rough, still marked. It wasn't necessary. I'm used to it. I know. He rose, approached, and for the first time in 5 years, touched not her face, not her hand, but the top of her head, an almost paternal, almost tender gesture. And that is precisely why it was necessary, because you are used to it, because you learn to swallow offenses as if it were the price of breathing. But you shouldn't. No one should. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that touch, that presence, that protection which was both comfort and chain. Rest now, he murmured. Tomorrow, they will leave. They will not return. And you will continue, as always, but with the certainty that in this house, under this roof, as long as I exist, no one laughs at you without paying the price. And then he left, silent as a shadow, closing the door behind him. She was left alone in the tiny room, her uniform still damp, her body exhausted, and for the first time in her life, she cried. Not from sadness, not from relief, but from something that had no name, a mixture of gratitude and terror, of comfort and guilt, of being protected and being a prisoner of that protection. Outside, the rain began again, and in the rooms on the second floor, 3 young men remained awake, unable to sleep, unable to forget, now carrying something that would mark them forever, the weight of having laughed at others, pain, and discovered, too late, that some laughs echo where they shouldn't. Dawn broke with a leaden sky, the light filtering through the clouds in gray tones that made morning feel like late afternoon. She woke without being sure if she had truly slept. Dreams and wakefulness blurred, forming a quilt of fragmented images. Her uniform was still damp, clinging to her skin, and the sweet smell of cola had mixed with sweat and fear, creating a perfume of humiliation that seemed embedded in her pores. She rose slowly, her body heavy as if carrying invisible stones. She changed her uniform for another identical one, washed her face with cold water that stung her swollen eyes, and descended into the silent hallways. The mansion seemed different that morning, or perhaps it was she who saw it differently. The towering walls, the ornate ceilings, the crystal chandeliers. Everything seemed to observe her with a new attention, as if the very edifice had witnessed what had happened the night before, and now recognized her not merely as a servant, but as something more. The other servants avoided her, not with hostility, but with that kind of nervous respect given to someone touched by something incomprehensible. They passed her in the hallways and lowered their eyes, murmured hurried greetings, veered away before they could be forced to converse. She didn't know if it was fear or reverence, or if, in the world where he reigned, those two things were indistinguishable. She was cleaning the main atrium, the very one where everything had begun, when she saw the 3 young men descending the staircase. Her steps paused, the still damp cloth in one hand, the bucket in the other, her body instinctively preparing for another humiliation. But when they saw her, something changed. The tallest, the one with fair hair who held the bottle with such nonchalance, froze halfway down. His face, once arrogant and carefree, was pale, marked by deep shadows under his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked, for the first time, and what she saw in that gaze was not superiority or cruelty, but something akin to terror. He quickly looked away, as if gazing at her for too long was painful, and continued descending in silence. The second, the youngest with the handsome face, trembled visibly. He held his bag so tightly that his fingers were white. And when he passed her, he murmured something that could have been an apology or just an inarticulate sound of panic. He didn't wait for a reply. He just hurried on, as if fleeing from something that could not be named. The third stopped. Just for a second. He looked at her hands, rough, marked, holding the cloth, and then at his own, still trembling slightly. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out, only a gaze, laden with something that seemed like regret or fear, or perhaps simply a belated understanding that she was real as he, and that the pain he had caused had weight and form. They left the mansion without looking back. They entered the carriage that awaited them with a haste that bordered on desperation. And when the door closed and the wheels began to roll over the wet gravel, she saw through the window the face of the tallest, pale as wax, looking not ahead but upwards towards the mansion's upper windows where he resided, a gaze that was half reverence, half horror. She remained there, alone in the empty atrium, as the sound of the carriage receded until it disappeared completely. She felt something strange in her chest. Not exactly satisfaction, not exactly victory, just emptiness. As if something had been rectified, but at a cost she wasn't sure should have been paid. "You are thinking too much." His voice came from above, from the upper gallery, where he leaned on the marble railing as if he had always been there, observing. It is a human weakness, to think too much about justice. She raised her eyes, finding him shrouded in shadows even in daylight. It wasn't justice, it was terror. "It is the same thing," he replied, descending slowly. "Justice without fear is not justice. It is suggestion, and suggestions are ignored by those who have never faced consequences." He stopped before her, and she realized, not for the first time, how small she was next to him, how his presence seemed to fill all available space, making the air thick and heavy. But she also noticed something else. He was weary, not physically, for she doubted he experienced physical weariness, but in a deeper way, as if each intervention, each punishment, each correction of the natural order cost something that could not be recovered. "You didn't have to do that for me," she said, low, almost a whisper. "It wasn't for you." He touched her face again, that gesture which had become peculiarly his own, cold but gentle. "It was for me, because what is mine must be respected, and when it is not, I reflect." Reflect. She almost laughed, but the sound died in her throat. "Is that what you call it?" "That is how it works." He stepped back, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze distant. "There are laws older than those written on paper, laws of respect, of balance, of recognition. Breaking them has a price, it always has." She looked at her own hands, still holding the cloth, still ready to clean. "And me? What is my price?" He studied her for a long moment, his eyes too penetrating, too deep. "You have already paid. 5 years ago, when you accepted my hand instead of falling into the water, when you chose to exist instead of disappearing, that was your price? To continue living, to continue serving, to continue being. Doesn't sound like a reward." "It isn't. It's destiny." He turned, walking back to the stairs. "And destiny is not negotiated. It is merely fulfilled." She watched him ascend, each step echoing softly, until he disappeared into the shadows of the upper corridor. She was left alone again, the bucket still beside her, the cloth still in her hands, and the overwhelming sensation that her life, all of it, from that night by the river until now, was not truly hers. It was his. He had chosen her. He had saved her. He protected her. And protection, she realized with a tightening in her chest, was just another word for prison when one could not refuse. The following days were strange. The story of what had happened did not spread. Not exactly, but something changed in the behavior of the other servants. They began to treat her with a subtle, almost imperceptible deference. No one interrupted her when she worked anymore. No one gave her harsh orders anymore. Even the housekeeper, a stern woman with sharp eyes who had always treated her as less than nothing, now spoke in a careful tone, as if afraid that the wrong words might be heard by someone beyond her. She didn't like that. She preferred invisibility to respect based on fear, because the former meant she didn't matter, but the latter meant she mattered only because of the shadow that covered her, not for herself, but for what he was. At night, alone in her room, she began to question things she had never questioned before. What was she to him, really? Wife, he had said, but he had never touched her beyond ceremonial gestures, never slept beside her, never shown desire or need, only possession, as if she were a precious object to be guarded, protected, but not necessarily understood or loved. And she, what did she feel for him? Gratitude, certainly. Fear, sometimes. Respect, always. But love? She didn't know. She had never known what true love was. Only the distorted versions she saw in cheap romances, or heard in others' conversations. What he offered didn't fit any known definition. It was protection without warmth, presence without proximity, a bond without choice. A week after the incident, she dared to do something she had never done. She went up to his chambers. It wasn't forbidden. It had never been explicitly stated. But there was a tacit understanding that that space was his and his alone. But something impelled her, a need to understand, to see with her own eyes the place from which he observed the world. The door was ajar. She pushed it slowly, her heart pounding. The room was vast but curiously empty. No furniture beyond a simple bed, a bookshelf filled with ancient books whose titles she couldn't read, and an enormous window overlooking the city. The curtains were open, and through the glass she could see the world below, small, distant, insignificant. He stood with his back to her, looking out the window, his hands clasped behind his body. He did not turn when she entered, but she knew that he knew. He always knew. Why did you choose me? The question came out before she could stop it, raw and desperate. He remained motionless for a long moment. Then, finally, without turning. Because you were the first person in centuries who saw me and did not flee. Not because you weren't afraid, but because the fear was not greater than the weariness. And weariness I understand. She took a step forward, her hands pressed against her chest. I didn't want to be chosen. I just wanted to die. Or live. But be myself. You are yourself. Now he turned, and for the first time, she saw something on his face that was not absolute control. It was vulnerability. Small, almost imperceptible, but real. More than you were before. Because here, in this place, under this protection, you do not need to disappear to survive. But I also cannot leave. Silence, long, heavy, laden with unspoken truths. No, he admitted finally. You cannot, because the bond does not break. Not in this way. You saved me when you accepted my hand. I saved you when I prevented your fall. And mutual salvations create chains that even I cannot undo. She felt tears well up, but not fall. They merely burned. Then I am a prisoner. We are both. He approached slowly, and for the first time touched not her face, but her hands, rough, marked, trembling slightly. I, of an ancient oath to protect what is mine. You, of a gratitude you cannot abandon. And in between, something that has no name in any human tongue. She gazed at him, truly gazed, not with fear or respect, but with the eyes of someone who finally understood. He was not a monster. He was not a savior. He was simply ancient, lonely, trapped in a role he had chosen or been forced to play, and in which she had become the only company he could bear. What happens when you tire of me? She whispered. I do not tire. The answer was simple, direct. It is my curse. And in that moment, standing in the vast, empty room, with the city stretching out below and the weight of centuries hanging between them, she understood. Love was not what bound them. It was something deeper, more frightening. It was necessity. He needed someone who would not flee. She needed someone who would see her. And that mutual necessity had created something that was not beautiful, but was real. "May I stay here?" she asked, her voice small. He did not answer with words. He merely nodded, a minimal, almost imperceptible gesture. And she sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, watching him return to the window and resume his eternal vigil over the city that did not even perceive his existence. And for the first time since she had entered that mansion 5 years ago, she felt not happiness, but something akin to peace. A sad, melancholic peace, built on acceptance and not on choice. But peace nonetheless. The months that followed brought subtle changes, almost imperceptible to the inattentive eye, but profound to those who observed carefully. She continued cleaning the hallways, continued folding the immaculate sheets, continued existing on the silent margins of the mansion's life, but something within her had repositioned itself, like a bone that settles after a poorly healed fracture. She discovered that she had begun to observe, not just see, but truly observe. The people who came and went, the visitors in expensive clothes and empty smiles, the women adorned like Christmas trees, and the men who measured power by the volume of their voices. She observed and cataloged who spoke too much, who drank alone, who looked at others with poorly disguised envy. And she realized with increasing clarity that none of them were truly free. They merely wore different chains, made of gold and expectations instead of iron and necessity. He noticed, evidently, he always noticed everything. One afternoon, as she tidied the library, an immense hall with walls covered in books that seemed as ancient as he, she heard his familiar footsteps. She didn't need to look to know it was him. The temperature always dropped slightly when he approached, as if he carried with him a piece of permanent winter. "You've changed." It wasn't a question, it was an observation, spoken in that low voice that seemed to reverberate not in the air, but directly in her bones. She continued dusting a bookshelf, her movements slow and careful. "I haven't changed. I merely stopped pretending." Pretending what? That being invisible was a choice. She turned, meeting his gaze, still intense, still deep, but somehow less frightening than before. Or perhaps she had simply learned not to look away. It was a strategy, but strategies can change when the battleground changes. He tilted his head, a curiously human gesture for such an inhuman being. And what is the battleground now? This place. She opened her arms, indicating not just the library, but the entire mansion, the world contained within those walls. These hallways that I know better than anyone, these people who ignore my existence but depend on it, this beautiful prison where I chose to stay. Chose? I chose, she said with a firmness that surprised them both. Because leaving would be dying in another way. Outside, I am nothing. Here, I am at least yours. Something crossed his face, so quickly she almost missed it. Satisfaction, perhaps, or relief, or merely recognition that the bond between them, however strange, was real and accepted. "There are books here," he said, changing the subject with that abrupt fluidity that was characteristic of him, "that you can read, if you wish." She blinked, surprised. I can't read, not properly, only the basics." "Then learn." He walked to a specific bookshelf, his fingers sliding along the worn spines until he found a thin, ancient volume. He handed it to her carefully, like one passing something sacred. "Start with this one. It is poetry. It doesn't require logic, just feeling." She held the book, the cold, soft leather against her rough palms. She opened it to the first page and saw words in Old English, curved and elegant. She didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to feel the rhythm, the melody hidden in the phrases about love and loss and eternity. "Why do you give this to me?" she asked, her voice low. "Because prisons should have windows." He was already moving away, dissolving into the shadows between the bookshelves, even if they are made of paper. And so something new began. In the evenings, when her work was done, she went not to her tiny room, but to the library. She sat on the floor, leaning against a bookshelf, and read slowly, stumbling over the words, but persistent. The books taught her things she had never imagined possible, not just about the world, but about herself. She discovered a hunger within her, not for food, but for meaning, for beauty, for something beyond daily survival. He sometimes appeared, sitting silently in a distant armchair, watching her read. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The presence was enough. She reading, he observing, the silence between them more comfortable than any conversation. It was on one of those nights that they heard screams coming from the lower floor, followed by the sound of glass shattering. She rose quickly, the book falling from her lap, her heart racing. He remained seated, but his eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "Stay here," he ordered, rising with that impossible fluidity. But she didn't stay. Something in her, perhaps stubbornness, perhaps curiosity, perhaps just weariness of always being left behind, made her follow him. They descended together, he in front, she a few steps behind, until they reached the main hall where a chaotic scene was unfolding. A woman, young, richly dressed, her hair disheveled, stood among the shards of a vase that must have been very expensive. She was shouting at a servant, her face contorted in fury disproportionately large for the apparent crime. The servant, an even younger girl, perhaps 16, was cowering against the wall, tears streaming, shoulders trembling. "Idiot! Incompetent!" The woman raised her hand, ready to strike, and in that instant everything froze. Not literally, but it was as if time folded in on itself. The woman's hands stopped in the air, her fingers curled like claws, her face still contorted but now also confused. She tried to move and couldn't. Only her eyes moved, scanning desperately, until they found him. The lord of the ancient halls stood at the entrance to the hall, and his simple presence seemed to suck the light around him. He said nothing. He merely looked. And in that gaze there was judgment older than any human court. "This is not your home," he said finally, his voice low but somehow filling the entire space. "You are a guest, and guests do not strike those who serve them." The woman tried to speak, but no sound came out. She just stood there, trapped in a humiliating posture, her hands still raised, her body trembling with useless effort to move. He approached the cowering maid, extending his hand. The girl hesitated, eyes wide with fear, but finally accepted it. He helped her to her feet with surprising gentleness, until she stood, still trembling but no longer bent in submission. "Go," he told her. "Clean your face, rest. No one will bother you again tonight." The girl nodded quickly and ran off, leaving only him, the frozen woman, and her, observing everything from the doorway, her heart beating hard not from fear, but from something akin to pride. Pride in him, for doing this, for protecting not only her, but all the invisible ones in the house. "You," he addressed the frozen woman, "will leave at dawn. You will not return. And if you ever, anywhere, raise your hand to harm someone beneath you in power, you will remember this night? You will remember that there are eyes watching, always." He did nothing more. He simply turned and walked back, passing her without looking. But as he did, he whispered low enough for only her to hear, "You didn't stay." "I didn't stay," she admitted, following him. "Why?" She thought for a moment. "Because if I am trapped here, then it is my prison too, and I want to know what happens within it." He stopped halfway up the stairs, turning to face her, and then, for the first time since they met, he smiled. It wasn't a grand or warm smile, just a slight curving of his lips, almost imperceptible. But it was real. "You are learning," he said. "Learning what? That power is not just having strength, it is choosing when to use it." He continued ascending, but this time, she walked beside him, not behind. A small gesture, but one that meant something. A change in position, in perspective, in how she saw herself in that strange world. When they reached the library, he went straight to the shelf, taking out another book, this one thicker, more worn. He handed it to her without ceremony. "This one," he said, "is about kings and queens, about how to govern without cruelty, about how power without respect is merely tyranny in disguise. She held the book, heavy in her hands. You want me to govern? I want you to understand. He sat in his usual armchair. Because one day, when I am not here, someone needs to remember that the invisible ones matter, that cleaning is not just a physical act, but a restoration of order. That serving is not humiliation when done with recognized dignity. Are you leaving? The question came out more urgently than she intended. I don't know. An honest, raw answer. Existences like mine do not follow the same rules. I could be here for another 1,000 years. Or I could disappear tomorrow. But if I disappear, I need to know that something remained. Someone who carries what I have learned. She sat on the floor, opening the book, but did not read immediately. She merely stayed there, processing the magnitude of what he had said. He was training her. Not to replace him, that would be impossible. But to carry forward what he was, protector of the forgotten, voice of the silenced, shadow that terrified the cruel. I am not strong like you, she said finally. No. He agreed without hesitation. But strength comes from different places. Mine comes from centuries and from being something beyond human. Yours will come from knowing both sides, that of being trodden upon and of being lifted up, and that, in the end, is more powerful than any ancient magic. She began to read, and as she read about wise kings and cruel tyrants, about the delicate balance between justice and mercy, she began to understand. It wasn't just about the mansion, about him, about the servants. It was about the world, how it worked, how it broke, how it could be rebuilt. One brick, one word, one choice at a time, and outside, in the now empty hall, the woman who had been frozen finally regained movement. She fell to her knees among the shards, her body shaking with sobs that were not from physical pain, but from something deeper. And when dawn broke, she left in silence, carrying a lesson she would never be able to fully articulate, but which she would feel forever. That some offenses awaken things that are better left sleeping. And in the upper chambers, a woman who had been invisible was learning to see. Not just the world around her, but the power she had always hidden under layers of forced submission. The power to witness, to remember, to, when necessary, raise her voice. Even if that voice was merely the whisper that guided an ancient shadow in the right direction. Winter came with a fury that year, bringing snow that covered the city like a white shroud, and wind that howled among the mansion's towers like wailing souls. She was 24 now, and when she looked in the mirror, something she rarely did, she no longer saw the bent, invisible girl, but someone who was beginning to recognize herself. Her eyes were still dark and deep, but now they carried something that wasn't there before. Certainty. The library had become her sanctuary. She no longer read stumbling over words, but with a fluidity that surprised even herself. She devoured books on history, philosophy, poetry, each page a window to worlds she had never imagined possible. And he continued to appear, sitting in silence, observing with that attention that was both disturbing and comforting. It was on one of those nights, as the snow fell heavily outside and the fireplace crackled softly, that she dared to ask the question that had been building for months. Have you ever loved anyone? He did not answer immediately. He continued gazing at the flames, his face illuminated by orange flickers that danced in the shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded older than ever. Not in the way humans understand love. Then in what way? A long pause. As a mountain loves the valley, as winter loves the earth, it freezes. Not with warmth, but with presence. Inevitable, eternal. She closed the book she held, her hands resting on the leather cover. That doesn't frighten me anymore, you know? Your way of speaking in metaphors that sound like threats, but are merely twisted truths. He turned to face her, and in his eyes, there was something akin to curiosity. What frightens you then? The possibility of never discovering who I would be away from here? The words came out before she could stop them, raw and honest, that all this transformation, all this learning, is just a reflection of what you want me to be. silence so dense that even the crackling of the fire seemed to quiet. He rose, approaching slowly, until he stood before her. He extended his hand, not to touch her, but in offer. "Oh, come." She hesitated only a second before accepting. His fingers were cold, as always, but firm. He guided her not out of the library, but to the highest window, the one that overlooked the entire city. Outside, the snow had transformed everything into a dreamlike landscape. Flickering lights, deserted streets, the world reduced to soft contours and white silences. "See that city?" He pointed with his chin. "Full of people, all believing they are free, all caught in webs they cannot see, of money, of expectation, of fear of others, judgment. Do you think they know who they truly are? I don't know. Perhaps some, he agreed, most live and die without ever discovering, because discovering who one is requires first surviving, and survival consumes all time, all energy." He turned to her. "You survived here, under this roof, and now you have a luxury that most will never have. Time to discover not who I want you to be, but who you choose to be." "And if I choose to leave?" The question hung in the air like a suspended blade. He did not answer immediately. He merely looked, truly looked, as if scanning not just her face, but her soul. "Then leave." Simple, direct, impossible. She blinked, shocked. "What?" "The door is not locked. It never has been. You can leave now. Walk through the snow. Go back to that river where we met and choose again." His voice carried no anger or resentment, only a terrible calm. "But know this, if you leave, the bond breaks. And when it breaks, it cannot be mended. I will not come for you. I will not protect you from afar. You will be free, completely, absolutely free, and alone." She felt her heart clench, not from fear, but from sudden understanding. She was not a prisoner. She never had been. It was a choice, made first out of desperation, then out of habit. But now it would have to be conscious. To stay not because she couldn't leave, but because she chose to stay. "Why tell me this now?" she whispered. "Because you are ready to hear." He released her hand, stepping back. "And because revenges protect for a time, but decisions sustain forever." She looked at the city outside, then at the hall behind her, the books, the fireplace, the hallways she knew by heart. She thought of the life she might have outside, anonymous again, free from ancient shadows and complicated oaths. But she also thought of the library, of the silent nights of reading, of the strange comfort of being seen by someone who did not judge, merely observed. "I stay," she said firmly, "not because I must, but because I want to." Something crossed his face, relief, perhaps, or satisfaction, but it was brief, soon masked by his usual calm. Then the choice is made, and conscious choices carry a different weight than imposed destinies. That night, she did not sleep. She stayed awake in the small room, looking at the ceiling, processing the magnitude of what had happened. She could leave. She always could have. What bound her were not external chains, but internal ones. Gratitude, comfort, fear of the unknown. And now that she knew this, her permanence gained new meaning. It was not surrender, it was choice. And choosing to stay was, in a strange way, more liberating than being forced to leave. The following days brought a subtle but noticeable change. She walked differently through the hallways, not bent, not hidden, but with a posture that recognized her own space. The other servants noticed, some with respect, others with poorly disguised envy, but no one dared to comment, because everyone knew she was different, protected, chosen. It was on one of those days that the letter arrived, brought by a nervous messenger who handed the sealed envelope to the housekeeper and left too quickly, as if the paper itself burned. The housekeeper, with the expression of someone biting a lemon, went up to her room. "For you." She extended the envelope as if it were a contaminated object. She took it, confused. She had never received correspondence. She didn't even know anyone who would write to her. She opened it carefully, removing the thin, expensive paper. The handwriting was elegant, the words chosen with precision. To the woman who cleans the halls, I acknowledge my offense. I have carried its weight since that night. I do not ask for forgiveness. I know I do not deserve it. I merely wanted you to know that I have not forgotten. I never will. There was no signature. It wasn't needed. She recognized it. One of the young men, the tallest one, with fair hair. 6 months later, he still carried the weight of what had been done to him that night. She held the letter, her hands trembling slightly, contradictory emotions battling within her. Part of her felt satisfaction. He remembered. He felt. He carried. But another part, smaller but growing, felt something akin to pity. Because now she understood. Revenge does not heal. It merely redistributes pain. She went up to his chambers, finding him where he always was, by the window, watching the city. She showed him the letter without words. He read it quickly, returned it, and what do you feel? I don't know. Raw honesty. I should feel avenged, but I just feel weary. Revenge wearies. He looked back outside. That is why the ancients practiced it little, not out of kindness, but out of economy. Carrying anger is labor, and eternal labor exhausts even gods. Then why did you do it? Because you could not do it for yourself, and because some lessons need to be taught, or the cruel never learn. A pause. But now you can choose to respond or not, to extend forgiveness or not. The power is yours. She looked at the letter again. She could tear it, ignore it, let him continue suffering in silence. Or she could respond, not with complete forgiveness, which would be a lie, but with recognition that he had at least tried, that acknowledging a mistake was already a step most did not take. That night, sitting at the small writing desk he had placed in her room, she wrote, slowly, the words stumbling on the paper as they once had stumbled in books. I acknowledge your acknowledgement. It is not forgiveness. Not yet. But it is a beginning. Carry your weight with dignity. Use it to be better. It is all I can offer. She sealed the letter, handed it to the messenger the next day. She didn't know if it would arrive. She didn't know if it mattered. But she had made her choice, not to let others' pain define who she was. Because satisfied revenge could bring momentary relief, but conscious compassion built something more enduring. He found her in the library that night, reading as always. He said nothing, merely sat in the armchair. But there was, in his silence, something she interpreted as approval, not of the specific decision, but of the fact that she had decided, without asking permission, without seeking validation, merely choosing and bearing the consequences. You are growing, he said finally. I am getting old, she corrected with a half-smile. It is not the same thing. He closed his eyes, head reclined. Aging is inevitable. Growing is a choice, and you choose every day to grow. She continued reading, but the words danced on the page, diffused. Because she had realized something, he was proud, in a strange, ancient way, incomprehensible to most, but proud. And that, in a way she couldn't explain, mattered more than a stranger's forgiveness or the satisfaction of a well-executed revenge. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and inside the mansion, in two different corners of the same room, two improbable existences found something akin to peace. He on eternal vigil, she in constant growth. It wasn't love. She still didn't know if it would be. But it was real, solid, built on choices, and not on inevitable destiny. And sometimes, that was enough. Spring arrived late that year, as if winter reluctantly relinquished its icy grip on the land. But when it finally came, it brought with it changes, not just in the budding trees or the returning birds, but in the very structure of the mansion. There were whispered conversations among the oldest servants, worried glances exchanged in the dark hallways, and a kind of tension in the air that she recognized but couldn't name. He was different. Not visibly. He was still the same imposing figure, still carried that presence that made the air vibrate. But she, who had learned to read his silences better than most people's words, perceived it There was weariness, not physical, but existential, as if the weight of centuries was finally beginning to exact a price that could not be postponed. "Are you well?" she asked one night when she found him on the upper balcony, looking not at the city, but at the sky, black, sprinkled with stars that seemed too distant to matter. Well is relative when one lives as long as I do. An evasive answer, but honest in its own way. She approached, standing beside him, her arms crossed against the cold that still lingered even with spring. "Something is changing. I feel it. You have always been too sensitive for your own good." But it wasn't a recrimination. It was almost admiration. "Tell me." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Soft, but firm. She had learned that with him, certainty worked better than pleading. He sighed, a sound so rare coming from him that she was startled. There are cycles, even for beings like me. Moments when the connection to this world strengthens, and moments when it weakens. I am entering a period of weakening. What does that mean? It means that my power will not be as absolute as it once was, that the protections I maintain over this house, over you, over everyone here, will begin to falter. A heavy pause. And it means that those who have always wished to challenge my authority will sense the weakness and will come. A cold fear ran down her spine. Who? Others like me, not identical, never identical, but similar. Ancient beings who dispute territories, influence, souls. He finally faced her, and his eyes gleamed with something akin to concern. And there are those who hate me for what I have done, for what I have protected, who will see in this moment a chance to attack not me directly, but what is mine. Me. It wasn't a question. You. A simple, devastating confirmation. She swallowed hard, trying to process it. What do we do? You do nothing. You stay here, protected as long as my strength lasts. And when he stopped, correcting, if something happens to me, you leave. You take what you can carry and go far away, to where my name does not echo. No. The negative came out harsh, unyielding. He raised an eyebrow, a rare gesture that indicated genuine surprise. No. I will not leave and let you face alone whatever comes. She turned to face him directly, her eyes burning with a determination she didn't know she possessed. You taught me that power is choosing when to use strength. You taught me about dignity, about protection, about not bowing one's head, and now you expect me to flee at the moment you most need someone by your side? I don't need... You do. She interrupted him, something she had never done before. You may not admit it, you may not understand it in a human way, but you need it. Because eternal solitude is not strength, it is a curse. And I will not let you face it alone. Silence. Long laden. And then, something extraordinary. He touched her face. Not with his usual coldness, but with something closer to warmth, to gratitude, to recognition that this fragile, mortal creature before him offered something that centuries of power had never given him. Genuine companionship in a moment of weakness. You are foolish, he murmured. I learned from you. He almost smiled. Almost. Then stay. But if I order you to leave, promise me you will. Without question, without hesitation. I promise. A white lie. Both knew it. But he accepted it because sometimes temporary comfort is worth more than inconvenient truth. The following days were strange. The mansion seemed darker, even under the spring sun. Shadows lengthened beyond the natural, and things that had always been solid seemed to flicker at the edges of vision. The servants felt it, many asked for leave, fled to visit distant relatives. Only the oldest, those who owed him as much as she did, remained, and she, always her, she prepared in her own way, not with weapons. What human weapon would serve against ancient beings? But with knowledge. She read all the books he had indicated about ancient wars, about pacts and revenges between creatures that did not follow mortal rules. She learned names, weaknesses, histories, and she memorized, because memory was a weapon that could not be confiscated. It was on a moonless night that they came. They did not knock on the door, did not announce their presence. They simply were 3 figures at the main entrance, tall and enveloped in shadows that did not correspond to the available light. She saw them from the upper stairs, her heart pounding but her breathing controlled. He descended to meet them, each step measured, controlled. She followed, against implicit orders, against common sense, but she followed. She stood a few steps above, watching, witnessing. "Lord of the ancient halls," said the middle one, his voice like metal scraping stone. "We hear your vigil weakens. You heard wrong. A blatant lie, spoken with absolute conviction. We do not lie to ourselves." The one on the left, shorter, with eyes that gleamed red in the dark, "We feel it. Your essence falters, and when it falters, territories change hands. This territory will not change." Unwavering firmness, but she noticed, in the way he positioned himself, in the slight tremor at the edges of the shadow that enveloped him, that it cost him effort to maintain the facade. Then prove it. The third, until now silent, stepped forward. Prove that you still deserve the title you bear. Prove that you can still protect what is yours. And then they did something she didn't expect. They looked at her. All 3, simultaneously, turned their heads at an unnatural angle and stared, not with desire or hunger, worse, with calculation, as if measuring value, weakness, the ideal pressure point to break the Lord of the ancient halls. "She is not part of this," he said, his voice dropping an octave, gaining a resonance that made the walls tremble. "She is the heart of it." The middle one tilted his head. "Everyone knows. You who never loved, who never bound beyond oaths of power, chose a mortal, weak, fleeting, and now she is your weakness, and weaknesses." "Our targets," completed the red-eyed one. It happened too fast to fully process. One of them, the third, moved in a blur, not walking, but simply existing in the place where she stood, a hand extended to grab, to snatch, to take, but he was faster. Despite the weakness, despite the cycle, despite everything, he was faster. He materialized between her and the attacker, and the shock when their essences collided was physical. A pressure wave that broke windows, extinguished candles, made the very floor crack. She was thrown backward, hitting the wall, the breath knocked from her lungs. When she managed to focus again, she saw he was fighting, not physically, because this went beyond physical. It was a battle of wills, of essences, of ancestral powers trying to dominate one another, and he was losing, not quickly, but visibly. His form flickered, the shadows that always enveloped him dissipated at irregular edges. She got up, staggering, her mind racing. She couldn't fight, she couldn't face them, but she could do something she had learned from him. Use knowledge as a weapon. You violate ancient law. Her voice tore through the air, surprisingly strong. Territories are disputed in formal challenge, not in ambush. To attack in a moment of recognized cyclical weakness is to declare oneself a coward. And cowards do not govern, they merely hide. Abrupt silence. The 3 visitors froze, not physically, but in attention. Because she had uttered the correct terms, invoked rules older than hatred or ambition. And rules, in that world of ancient creatures, carried a weight that brute force did not. "Presumptuous mortal," hissed the red-eyed one. "You do not understand what you speak of." "I understand perfectly." She descended the steps, her legs trembling but her posture erect. "I have read the codes. I know the laws. And I know that if you kill him now, in this manner, every territory you conquer will be tainted. No other ancient will recognize it. You will be pariahs." Truth. She could see it in their hesitation, in the way they exchanged glances. They had not expected a mortal to know the rules, let alone invoke them correctly. The middle one took a step back. "This does not end here. When the cycle passes and strength returns, if it returns, we will be back, in the proper way. We will be waiting," she said, as if she had any power to make such a promise. They dissolved. They did not leave. They simply ceased to be. and in the silence that followed, he collapsed. Not completely, but his knees buckled and he had to lean against the base of the staircase. She ran, falling beside him, her hands touching shoulders that for the first time were not solid as stone, but trembled slightly. He was breathing heavily, something he never did. Saved? How did you know? You taught me. The books, the ancient laws, everything you made me read. She held his face, forcing him to look at her. You said knowledge was a weapon, and you were right. He gazed at her, and in his eyes, there was something she had never seen before. Not gratitude, not relief, something deeper, more frightening, more real. You are foolish, he repeated the words from the balcony. I am your foolish one, she whispered, and for the first time, he did not correct her. He did not deny it. He merely pulled her closer, an awkward and cold embrace, but an embrace nonetheless, his first in 5 years. And she allowed herself to sink into it, feeling not warmth, but security. Presence, a choice made real. Outside, spring continued to fight against the remnants of winter. Inside the mansion, 2 improbable souls discovered that protection was not a one-way street, and that sometimes the weak save the strong not with power, but with knowledge and courage foolish enough to stay when it would be wiser to run. The months that followed that night brought changes neither of them expected. He gradually regained his strength, like a tide that returns after a long retreat. His shadows became solid again, his presence absolute again. His power again made the lights tremble when he passed, but something had changed. Not in him externally, but between them. The awkward embrace of that night had created a fissure in a wall they had both carefully constructed. And through that fissure, improbable things began to flow. He began to seek her out not only in the library, but during the day. He would appear in the atrium while she cleaned, observing in silence, and when she asked if he needed anything, he would simply reply no, that he was just there. He began to teach not only through books, but through conversations, about the centuries he had lived, about civilizations he had seen rise and fall, about the weight of witnessing history without being a part of it. And she, in turn, began to understand. Not completely. She doubted a human could fully comprehend such a vast existence, but enough to realize that his solitude was not a choice, it was a consequence. That absolute power created an insurmountable distance, and that she, by some accident of destiny and stubbornness, had managed to cross that distance. Why did you truly choose me? She asked on a summer afternoon, sitting side by side in the library, the golden light of sunset filtering through the windows. He thought for a long time. Because when I saw you that night, by the river, I saw not surrender, but calculation. You did not want to die. You wanted to stop suffering. And there is a difference. Those who surrender, I let go. But those who calculate, who measure the cost of existence against the cost of absence and decide consciously, those have a strength that most do not possess. And now, after everything, do you still see that? I see more. He gazed at her, and for the first time since they met, there were no layers, no disguises, only raw honesty. I see someone I saved, but who also saved me, who transformed a prison into a home, not because she was forced, but because she chose to make something of a place that could have been only suffering. She felt tears well up, not from sadness, but from recognition, of being seen completely, without filters or judgments. I love you. The words came out simple, without artifice. I don't know if in the right way, I don't know if in the way humans are meant to love, but I love you, in the twisted, complicated, impossible way that this is. Silence. He did not answer immediately. He merely held her hand, a small gesture, but immense in significance. His cold fingers intertwined with her warm ones, the difference between eternal and ephemeral being softened by something as simple as conscious touch. Human love dies, he said finally. It ages, changes, disappears, but this... He squeezed her hand lightly. "This that we have built is different. It does not die because it does not live in the way love lives. It exists. As a mountain exists, as an ocean exists, it simply is. Is it enough?" A vulnerable, frightened question. It is more than enough. It is all I have to offer. And it was. She knew there would be no passionate kisses under moonlight, no promises of happy eternity, no kind of romance she read in books, but there would be this: constant presence, fierce protection, mutual recognition that two improbable beings found in each other something the rest of the world could not offer. The years passed. She reached 28, then 30. Her body began to show signs of time, fine lines around her eyes, strands of silver in her dark hair, hands that still cleaned but with slightly more careful movements. He remained the same, immutable, eternal. And this could have been a source of sadness, a constant reminder that she would age and he would not. But somehow, it wasn't. It was just fact, like rain or sun, inevitable, but not necessarily painful. The mansion prospered under their care, his through silent protection, hers through meticulous organization. The servants were well treated, guests quickly learned the unwritten rules, and stories about the place spread, not of terror, but of strange justice. They said that there, the weak were protected and the cruel learned, that there was something ancient and powerful watching, but not malevolent, merely attentive. One day, she was 32, he was countless ages. They were on the upper balcony when she asked something she had been holding on to for years. "When I die," she began, ignoring the way he stiffened, "what will you do?" "We will not speak of this. We must." She turned to face him. "I am mortal. You are not. It is a reality we cannot ignore forever." He closed his eyes. For the first time, he truly seemed old, not in body, but in soul. "I do not know, existing for so long. I have never had to think about loss like this. I have lost acquaintances, allies, enemies, but never." A painful pause, never someone who mattered. "Then you will have to learn." She held his face, forcing him to open his eyes. "And when you learn, when I am no longer here, promise me you will not close this place. You will not let it become a tomb. Promise me you will continue protecting the invisible ones, the forgotten ones, those who need a gentle shadow against the world's cruelties. How can I promise that when I do not know if I can exist without you?" The question came out broken, raw, and she realized with a shock that he was afraid, not of other ancient beings, not of losing power, but of losing her. And with her, the only link to something akin to humanity that he had managed to build. "You will." She kissed his forehead, a tender gesture that he allowed himself to receive. "Because I will teach you. In the years that remain, I will teach you how to continue, how to find purpose that does not depend solely on me, how to live without you." He completed, bitterly. "How to honor what we had by continuing what we started." A gentle correction. And so they did. In the following years, she not only managed the mansion, but trained successors. She found among the servants those with the silent strength she recognized, those who had been broken but not destroyed, those who knew humiliation but maintained dignity. She taught them not only to clean and serve, but to observe, to protect each other, to create a community where hierarchy might have created only exploitation. He observed, learned, and slowly, very slowly, he began to participate. He spoke with the servants, something he had never done. He learned names, stories, small fears, and even smaller dreams. And in the process, he became not less powerful, but more human. Or something close. When she reached 40, her body already showed the accumulated weariness of a difficult life. Her knees ached on cold mornings, her hands trembled at the end of the day, but her eyes remained alive, bright, full of purpose and a twisted but real love. One winter night, lying side by side in his bed, a custom they had developed in recent years, she finding comfort in his eternal coldness, he learning that physical presence could be as meaningful as any power. she whispered. I regret nothing. Not the river, nor the cola, nor any choice that brought me here. Nor I. A simple answer, but heavy with the weight of centuries. Promise you'll remember, always, and promise you'll continue until I can no longer. It was enough. She slept, and for the first time in years, she slept without fear of what was to come. Because she had built something. Not perfect, not conventional, but real and lasting. Years later, she at 50, he eternal, they still worked together. She no longer cleaned, her body no longer allowing it. But she organized, taught, managed, and he protected, observed, slowly learning how to be not just strength, but also kindness. And when the inevitable day finally came, when her breath stopped and her body completely tired, he would know what to do. Not because it wouldn't hurt, it would hurt in ways that ancient beings should not be able to feel, but because she had taught him, pain is the price of loving, and prices are paid with dignity. And in the mansion's hallways, the invisible ones would continue to be seen. The humiliated would continue to be lifted up. Because there was something there, not just ancient power, but the legacy of a woman who one day chose to stay instead of fall. And by staying, transformed a prison into a home and solitude into companionship. For there are offenses that cannot be washed away with apologies, only with silence and waiting. And there are loves that are not measured in passion, only in repeated choices. Day after day, to stay, to see, to acknowledge. And in that house, silence had always belonged to her. But now, it belonged to both of them. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts us is what makes us most human.